The carbon price path, price on pollution, I don't know the polite way to say it, but out to $170 by 2030 is exactly the right policy.
He's worse than we originally thought. Welcome back to Moose on Loose. My name's David. Today's top story here. Going to be going through an article and a bunch of different video clips, ping-ponging back and forth on Mark carbon tax Carney. We got an article that was written by Peter Foster in the National Post 3 years ago on carbon tax Carney, where it breaks down his book, and there's a lot of telling information in there on this guy. He is much worse than we ever thought. So we got this article in the National Post from Peter Foster here. It says, Mark Carney, man of destiny, arises to revolutionize society. It won't be pleasant. Those are some reassuring words, aren't they? What Carney ultimately wants is a technocratic dictatorship justified by climate alarmism. In his book, Value, Building a Better World for All, Mark Carney, former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, claims that Western society is morally rotten. And that has been corrupted by capitalism, which has brought about a climate emergency that threatens life on Earth. This, he claims, requires rigid controls on personal freedom, industry, and corporate funding. That intro there basically sums up Mark Carney. Here we got a clip of Mark carbon tax Carney from a year ago talking about climate change.
We don't need any more empty promises.
Greta Thunberg rightly blasted everyone, words to the effect of, you've stolen my dreams and my childhood. And right here, right now, is where we draw the line. Right here, right now, is where finance draws the line.
Mark Carney is one of the most prominent global voices calling for climate action around the world. The former governor of the Bank of Canada and Bank of England is also the UN Special Envoy on climate action and finance. I spoke with him earlier last week about the climate crisis, wildfires, and of course the impact of higher interest rates on Canadians. Mark Carney, nice to see you. Appreciate you doing this.
Thanks for having me, Rosemary.
I want to start obviously with what we're seeing outside. Unprecedented season of wildfires. That's what the government says. As the UN Special Envoy on climate change, when you see this and the way it's impacting not only this country, but also now the US, what are your concerns about whether we're moving quickly enough on climate change?
Well, I guess the first thing to say is that this was predictable. In fact, it was predicted. And in fact, unfortunately, it's going to get worse. Even if we do succeed, we're at 1.1, 1.2 degrees of global warming. We're trying to limit it to 1.5 degrees, but that's still a deterioration from where we are today. And on current efforts, we're going to overshoot that. So it's concerning. And I think I'd observe as well that what we've been living through, and it's terrible human costs where the fires are, whether it's in Val-d'Or or Grand Prairie or in Sherburne County in Nova Scotia and across the country. But of course, the health costs that we're experiencing over the course of a few days. Now, this is what millions of people, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people live through today around the world as well, which underscores the urgency of action.
I want to ask you about one of the places that was affected by wildfire, that's Alberta, that just re-elected a UCP government with Danielle Smith. One of the things that she said the night that she was elected that she's very concerned about is a cap on oil and gas emissions. She's also concerned about the...
So fast forward here, they've gone ahead with that cap, and now that is biting us in the butt here as we go into this tariff situation with Donald Trump. And a side note, a larger percentage of wildfires in Alberta are caused by arson. You're seeing this in California. There's not just one, two, but three. There's multiple people that have been arrested now for arson for burning down LA. There should be stricter punishments like 35 years in jail for arson. If we didn't waste so much money on stupid things like sending money over to the Democratic Republic of Congo, we could buy little solar cameras at all these different places that we don't have cameras and figure out who starts these fires. This isn't rocket science, but they want to scare everyone with the climate change agenda.
The net zero electricity grid by 2030. And she told my colleague David Cochrane that she believes that Canada can reach its climate goals without this cap. So first of all, I'd like to know whether you think that is doable, and whether the technology that she seems to believe is coming on board can get Canada there without a cap.
Okay. Well, first thing, the oil and gas sector in Canada produces more than a quarter of our emissions. Yeah. So and that's in the production and transportation of oil and gas, not the actual use of oil and gas in our cars, used to heat some homes and other things. So we can't meet our ultimate objectives, which is to get to net zero emissions, which, by the way, is what we have to do to prevent the wildfires and the other climatic events from getting worse. What the world has to do, we can't get there unless we do not just have a cap on emissions, but those emissions are brought effectively to zero. Now, So that's the climate physics. You don't need to be a meteorologist. You don't need to be a climate scientist. It's the simple math of it.
This whole time, this is the guy who's been behind Trudeau, feeding him the ideas, pushing the agenda. Trudeau was just the WF puppet executing his orders. We got the real WF overlord here who's been calling the shots. Welp, this just proves the failure he is. Investment has fled Canada, businesses shutting down. The only growth in our economy has been through increasing size of government and heavily subsidized immigration who have no incentive to work. Carney's brave new world will be one severely constrained. Choice, flying less meat, more inconvenience, more poverty. Assets will be stranded. Used gasoline-powered cars will be unsaleable. Inefficient properties will be unrentable. He promises. The agenda's objectives are already being enforced. It goes on to basically say here, not primarily by legislative, but by the application of non-governmental, non-democratic pressure on the corporate sector via the ever-expanding ESG, environmental, social, and corporate governance, and the sustainable finance, which is designed to starve non-compliant companies of funds, thus rendering them, as Carney puts it, climate roadkill. What ESG actually represents is a corporate ideological compulsion. It is the key of stakeholder capitalism.
As a central banker, that we're going to raise interest rates if inflation starts to get out of the way. The market starts to adjust to that, and it means that you don't have to raise interest rates as much. Same works in climate, and we've seen it work, but it's part of the reason why Europe is going to be 80% down on their emissions by the end of this decade. Those are order of magnitude solutions.
So you just mentioned Europe being down 80% their emissions. Let's take a look at their GDP versus America's. So I came across this post here on X. It says, I'm German. 16 years ago, the EU and US economies were neck and neck. Today, the US economy is 50% larger than the entire EU combined. You can see the huge spike here. The EU is 80% carbon neutral. Where did all that money go? It's not to their GDP. Is it creating jobs? Is it creating prosperity? Doesn't look like it. Jumping over to this video here from the World Economic Forum, listen to what Mark Carney says about who he represents.
Mark, you look like you were about to...
Yeah, it was a tell.
As a European, as a
European, I am a European, actually. Yeah.
Oh, you are?
Yeah.
Oh.
He is a European. Yeah, that's what he is. He's a European.
Irish citizen, yeah. So there you go.
Welcome.
Speaking as a European, I like to say the following.
He's a European citizen. Speaking as a European, are you kidding me? This guy wants to run Canada, goes around saying he identifies as European. As this account says, tell me you don't have Canadians' interest at heart without telling me you don't have Canadians' interest at heart. He does not. He has interests of WF at heart. So it goes on to talk about the United Nations. He's got a big effect there, as well as he's a staunch supporter of the WF, where Carney is a trustee.
What we are very proud of now, the young generation, like Prime Minister Trudeau, is that we penetrate the cabinets. So
penetrate the cabinet. Like, when is this guy going to be done with his whole global takeover? Like, enough's enough, Klaus.
Yesterday I was at a reception for Prime Minister Trudeau. Half of this cabinet are actually young global leaders of the World Economic Forum.
Yeah, we know that. You've penetrated the cabinet. We know all the liberals are corrupt. Carney clearly feels himself to be a man of destiny. When I worked at the Bank of England, he writes in Value, I would remind myself each morning of Marcus Aurelius' phrase, arise to do the work of humankind. He's just as narcissistic as Trudeau. I mean, look at these other quotes he's got here. Remember, Moltzer, that you have great things to do. Goes on to say that Carney has in common with Saint Simon, who believed that the society should be ruled by savants like himself, an alliance of engineers and other technocrat individuals, along with the bankers. This one too here, where he says, should there be a market in the right to have children? Why not auction the right to opt out of military service? Why shouldn't universities sell audition to raise money for worthy causes? But the very fact that people reflexively feel uneased about the outright reject such notions entirely disproves his point. People do not believe that everything is or should be for sale.
For one quick question for each of you. So, Mr. Simieritsch, I wanted to ask you about Mark Carney's declaration there on the Daily Show that he's an outsider. Why is he trying to sell himself as an outsider? Isn't being the party's economic advisor the ultimate insider role?
Well, he's been the economic advisor, I think, for 4 months to the Liberal Party of Canada. But when you look at his experience, his resume, and served during the time of the financial crisis, and I worked in New York City and back in Toronto during the financial crisis, and Mark Carney was front and center in handling the financial crisis, which impacted, the United States and Canada and across the world. We all remember 2008, and he was there. That experience and the experience of being the governor for the Bank of England, that pedigree. And, we in Canada talk about successful Canadians. Mark Carney is someone who, has a family, grew up in Canada, went to university, did well for himself.
I'm not debating his success. It's just the idea that he's an outsider.
Well, look, the fact of the matter is...
This guy went on a big rant and wasn't even remotely answering the question.
Mark Carney was doing other things with his career, and he is an outsider. He's not sitting in cabinet right now. He's not an elected member of parliament. He is an outsider.
Bassie's not buying that, man.
He's someone who's coming to the table with a lot of experience, a lot of ambitions, and someone that I look to and say, facing the challenges that we face today, decarbonization, globalization, the shift in geopolitical politics, what's happening down in the States, right-wing populism, someone who understands the world, someone who understands what's happening here in Canada and where we need to take Canadians in Canada and meet Canadians where they're at. Canadians today are not where they were in 2015. Where they are today, I believe Mr. Carney understands it. I've had an extensive conversation with him, and I believe he is best positioned to take Canada forward and take the Liberal Party of Canada forward.
Super Mario here is out to lunch. He doesn't know what he's talking about.
Ms. Mendes, if Mr. Carney is going to position himself that way in a campaign, I think the comparative he's trying to draw is one where Minister Freeland is the ultimate insider if he is a quote-unquote outsider, which, of course, as you just heard, I think a lot of Canadians would challenge the merit of that characterization. But still, that's the framing, it looks like, of the leadership race. Ultimately, do you think that is a successful narrative for Mark Carney, given the feelings of Canadians right now toward Justin Trudeau and your government?
I'm not going to comment on Mr. Carney's candidacy because I don't actually know him, so I've never met with him or had a conversation with him.
I'm not going to comment. Why are you on the panel? Why are you here? Carney has been a prime pusher of net zero, the notion that climate-related human emissions must be entirely eradicated, buried, or offset by 2050 if the world is to avoid climate Armageddon. He claims that net zero is highly valued by society. Just listening to him speak, he talks of net zero as being this goal that we all have. But it's his goal. It's his thing. It's not our thing. They've pushed this on us. Going through this and listening to Mark Carney, you really get a sense that he's been the underlining force that's been pushing through Trudeau. These guys have known each other for years. Trudeau's been soaking this in and basically playing out his agenda, Carney's agenda, for years. In reality, the vast mass of people have no clue what it entails. When Carney talks about this version of society, he's talking about a small radical element of it. Carney also commends the knowledge and wisdom of Swedish teenager Greta Thunberg. You bet he does. The power of Greta Thunberg's message lies in the ways she drives home both the cold logic of climate physics and the fundamental unfairness of the climate crisis.
A 66% probability we will not hit 1.5 degrees if we, the world, keep emitting at the pace we're emitting at present. And within 10 years, we'll run it out. And that's what, Greta Thunberg, if we've got a teenager who can figure this out, we should be able to figure it out and follow through. She just...
Yeah, they're all just touting Greta Thunberg as this climate hero that knows all. Come on, guys. Seriously?
The relentless logic of that. And she's right about that. That's what the science says. Now, obviously, if we bend the curve down in terms of our emissions globally, then we extend the amount of time over which we can get to net zero and we have to get to net zero to stabilize the temperature. So that's and anything that...
Got to keep scaring the people, but don't worry, there's something else you can buy that'll save Canada, that'll save the world. China and India, though, the ones with all the pollution, don't worry about them. We won't be talking to them. We're just going to make Canadians suffer.
Reduces that trajectory, helps extend the timeline.
That trajectory is going to be your polling numbers as soon as you become prime minister and take over from Trudeau. Anyone who cites an obnoxious 17-year-old as an authority on climate science and moral philosophy should be an object of deep suspicion, but then, according to Carney, climate science is easy. Greta's basic calculations are ones she could easily master and powerfully project. It says here in early 2020, Greta demonstrated her complete disconnect from reality when at the WF in Davos, she called for an immediate cessation of emissions, which would tank the world economy and potentially end millions of people's lives. Even Carney admits deviating from her wisdom on that point. This is the radical policy we're seeing. These people, they get this idea that if you just put up a solar panel, if you just put one little windmill out there, everything gets powered. That's not how the world works. The world is run on all sorts of fuel sources, coal, oil and gas, solar, wind. When you look at the bulk of it, though, it's not the solar panels, it's not the windmills. There's a lot of energy that goes into making those things. They get destroyed. Oil and gas is what's powering our world right now. We've got nuclear coming on with these small modular reactors, which seems to be the cleanest source. When it comes down to it, we should be using our oil and gas as much as possible right now, making our country very rich and investing in research to find this utopian fuel source if it exists. If it doesn't, then we're already set up using oil and gas and we're already a wealthy country. Mark Carney has already pushed Trudeau to invest in all these different companies, Lion Electric, Stellantis, throwing our money at green EV companies that are all going out of business. It's destroying our country. If he had invested in refinery plants across Canada, we could get rid of Canadian taxes.
So, for example, here in Canada, the carbon price path, price on pollution, I don't know the polite way to say it, but the carbon price path out to $170 by 2030 is exactly the right policy for that, because you can start adjusting today for it.
$170, folks. What's the polite word for carbon tax? The polite way to say we're going to screw you over. We're going to take all your money. If we take a look at our current carbon tax, it's en route to $170 per ton by 2030. I wonder where that came from. I wonder. Here's our current carbon tax in Canada right now. So this is a little bit outdated, but basically we'll be right here. In 2025, it'll go up to $95 per ton. We're only halfway of Carney's plan here, but things will get a lot worse if he were to take over from Trudeau for another 4 years.
Similar thing in Europe and the UK, where internal combustion engines will no longer be for sale after 2030. Well, that tells me if I'm in the auto sector or the parts sector or the steel sector, the battery sector, where do I make my investments? And actually, because it's Europe and the UK, it's big enough that it sort of tells the rest of the advanced world where things are headed.
Is it headed that way because you guys invested in a bunch of EV companies and then you forcing everyone to go to EVs? We're not stupid. We know how this works. It says here, far from demonstrating a firm knowledge of climate system himself, Carney cites scary but misleading statistics. Since the 1980s, he writes, the number of registered weather-related loss events has tripled, and the inflation-adjusted losses have increased fivefold. Consistent with the accelerated pace of climate change, the cost of weather-related insurance losses has increased eightfold in real terms over the past decade at an annual average of $60 billion. He goes on to say he asked a professor here, Roger Pielke Jr., an expert on climate and economics at University of Colorado, and he said Carney has confused economics with weather. Part of Carney's strategy is to force voluntary standards on banking and industry, then have governments make those standards compulsory. The major accounting firms appear keen to promote the possibility of endless auditing. What it comes down to is Mark Carney is Captain Carbon here. Justin Trudeau was his minion the whole time. This has been his plan. He's been pushing it through Justin Trudeau. This is unsettling because Mark Carney is a rich man. Try to look up his net worth and it just says in the millions. This guy holds high positions. He's well connected and he's intertwined finance and climate change. And we already know they've used climate change to scare us. I mean, looking back to when I was a kid and every year forward, they've always had something. It's acid rain, just been to scare people into getting policies, things pushed through that would make people money. They're still pushing these heat pumps, even though they're not the solution we need here in Canada. It makes you ask, who's connected to the heat pumps? Who owns those companies? Who's making money from those? Trudeau keeps pushing them. Mark Carney keeps pushing them. Why do they want to sell so many heat pumps when clearly using clean natural gas is a better solution? Where I live out here on Vancouver Island, they're trying to outlaw natural gas and not have it be allowed. Net zero and UBI equal guaranteed destruction. Nothing worse than someone who believes he's smarter than everyone else. Carney is that guy. I'm not denying he's a smart guy, but his net zero ambitions is an unrealistic, unaffordable fantasy for Canada. I'm sure Guilbeault is salivating for Carney to win the Liberal leadership race. Whose ultimate objective? Just another WF. Will Carney give up the $9 million condo? This guy cannot be prime minister of our country for a day, a week, a month. It doesn't matter. He cannot win that race. Throw Mark Garrett's in there. Heck, even throw Nathan Erskine Smith, Jonathan Wilkinson, any one of these other wingnuts. Doesn't matter which one of them takes the fall. Carbon tax Carney cannot be the next prime minister of our country.